And unless we do transform our economies very quickly, to get out of fossil fuels, but also to get out of a whole lot of other damaging industries and into more benign ones, and in doing so to stimulate a great new food and industrial and indeed agricultural revolution, then it's hard to see us getting through this century.
The book review in The Times was titled Regenesis by George Monbiot, Why We Should Abolish Farming. Now, I suspect that lacks a little nuance, but perhaps not as much as the casual listener might think. George, welcome to the programme. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks,
What's the central idea in this book, and should steak lovers take a moment to prepare themselves?
Yeah. So, we're in big trouble in terms of both supplying the food that we're going to need for the next few decades, and in terms of doing so without trashing our life support systems. Food and farming are by far and away the greatest cause of environmental destruction. They cause the most habitat destruction, the most species loss, the most extinction, the most water use, the most soil destruction. They're one of the highest causes of climate breakdown, of water pollution, of air pollution. And yet we kind of give them a free pass. They're surrounded by so much cosy mythology and romanticism that we don't want to apply the standards to them that we might apply to other industries. Now, at the same time, partly because they in turn are being hammered by environmental catastrophe, as we've seen, for instance, just recently in India, where its wheat harvest has partly shriveled as a result of the great heat wave there, but also because the food system is becoming systemically unstable. It's beginning to look in some ways like the global financial system in the run-up to 2008. Our food supply is seriously compromised, and it's quite hard to see unless we have the kind of drastic change that I'm proposing in the book, how we're going to protect both the whole basis of our subsistence and the living planet on which that depends.
So in your plan, what farming would disappear? How much farming would remain?
So by far and away the biggest impact comes from livestock farming. And not just the intensive livestock farming, which everyone hates, which does indeed have a very big impact, but also the extensive farming, which so many people love, the free-range, pasture-fed beef and lamb, for example, which is so fetishized by foodies and celebrity chefs and a lot of environmentalists as well. In some ways, it's even worse environmentally than intensive meat production, and that's because of the vast amount of land it requires. And while, as environmentalists, we've been very good at paying attention to climate breakdown and to pollution and other issues like that, we've missed one of the biggest ones of all, which is land use. And the sheer amount of land we use for our extractive industries is possibly the biggest of all environmental issues. And that's because all the land which we use is land which can't be used for wild ecosystems, for forests, for wetlands, for savannas, on which a great majority of the world's species depend, and indeed on which the integrity of Earth systems themselves depend. Now, we campaign against urban sprawl, and we're right to do so. Urban sprawl's a blight on cities and a blight on the countryside. But urban areas in total occupy 1% of the planet's surface. Farming occupies 40%, which is pretty well all the land it can occupy, because the rest is deserts and ice caps and mountains and protected areas, and forests which should be protected but aren't. And of that 40%, the 12% is under crops, and an astonishing 28% of the planet's surface is used for grazing by livestock. And yet that 28% from grazing only produces just 1% of our protein. This is an astonishingly wasteful and profligate use of our most important resource, which is land.
And
sorry.
No, go on.
Well, and if we stop doing that, we would have a massive opportunity both to protect and restore ecosystems which have been trashed, and to draw down carbon dioxide from the atmosphere on a really huge scale. It's very hard to see how we can stay within even 2 degrees of global heating, let alone 1.5, unless, as well as decarbonising our economies, we draw down a lot of the carbon dioxide we've already produced. And by far the quickest and cheapest way of doing that is ecological restoration. Without all that livestock farming, we have a great opportunity to prevent both climate and ecological breakdown.
Okay, but this isn't just about the planet, as important as the planet is. This is also about people. You talk in the book about visiting a food bank and learning about poverty, obesity. Tell us about how your proposals are an answer to poverty, obesity. I think people can probably figure out for themselves what poverty, obesity is.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's quite striking the degree to which poverty and obesity are linked. Alongside other issues such as the sort of deliberate tailoring of junk food to override our appetite control. We obviously have a major food crisis now. We've been seeing it for quite a while developing worldwide. I mean, it comes as a big surprise to people to learn that chronic hunger has been rising since 2015. We believed until recently that hunger was on its way to extinction, and it had fallen pretty steadily from the 1960s until 2014. And then weirdly, in 2015, it began to rise. We've seen the squeeze in rich nations as well as poor nations. Obviously, it's much worse in the poor nations. And part of the problem here is, it seems, the systemic instability in the food system. Because weirdly, hunger began to rise just as food prices began to fall. And an economist would say, well, that's ridiculous. That can't happen. But this is what happened. That, between about 2008 and 2014, food prices were historically high, and yet hunger was falling throughout that time. And then in 2015, hunger shot up while food prices shot down. The global food index, price index, went from 115 in 2014 to 93 in 2015. And it stayed below 100 until 2021, and yet more and more people were going hungry. And what seems to have happened here is that, a bit like the approach to the financial crisis, we've seen a massive consolidation of the global food system into the hands of just a few big corporations. On one estimate, 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade, as well as a lot of the seed trade, chemicals, etc. Their behaviour is becoming quite synchronized. Nations have polarized into super exporters and super importers. We receive a huge amount of our grain worldwide from just a handful of nations, including, as we've recently discovered, Russia and Ukraine. And a very large amount of that trade goes through particular choke points like the Turkish Straits, the Suez Canal, Panama Canal, Bab el-Mandab, Straits of Hormuz and Malacca, which are highly vulnerable to disruption.
Yep.
And what seems to have happened is that as a system becomes less resilient, shocks are transmitted through it more easily. And so even when the global price is low, those shocks hammer the poorer nations and local prices go high and people go hungry. Sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say, as to some extent, we're seeing with Ukrainian-based grain shortages at the moment, or at least we'll be seeing very soon. Look, you call farming the most destructive force ever to have been unleashed by humans. Which, much as you make your argument well, is this the best way to win the attention of people who you really are going to need as allies? Perhaps, farmers and their supporters are very keen to defend themselves against your ideas. Are you concerned to win them over?
Well, it's a bit like criticising the fossil fuel industry. I mean, what I'm trying to do here is to create systemic change, or at least create the arguments for systemic change. And in a way, the last people you're going to win over when you're calling for us to leave fossil fuels in the ground are going to be the fossil fuel companies. But you're appealing to governments, you're appealing to people as a whole to say, we've got to change the regulations, we've got to change the way business is done. And the thing is with farming that farmers tell a story about themselves, which is that they can't change. We've always done it this way, and we always will. But it's a story which demeans them and actually doesn't reflect their extraordinary resourcefulness and resilience. Because I see farmers changing all the time. In fact, often hear sheep farmers in Wales saying, we've always done it this way and always will. And the next thing you know, they've signed a contract with a multinational to build a giant chicken factory. And they will follow economic incentives when those incentives change. They're very good at doing so. Now, given that nearly all the pastured livestock in rich nations is only there because of farm subsidies, because of public money, it's loss making. I mean, the average hill farm in England loses £16,600 a year from farming sheep, and the money comes almost entirely from the subsidy check. We can change that incentive without giving farmers any less money, but we can pay them to do something completely different, which is to restore ecosystems.
I mean, you're relatively keen on some sorts of farms. You write in the book about farms like Tolly's, super clever and sort of sustainable, and I think you say earth sensitive or organic farming. Can you hand in hand encourage more farms like that while getting rid of conventional farming? I mean, aren't these the same sort of transferable skills you're going to need people to know?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I'm not trying to get rid of conventional farming, but I am trying to promote a high yield, more ecological farming. I mean, there is a big problem with organic farming as well as with conventional farming, which is that its yields are often much lower, and that means more land is used. So we're back to that land problem. There's also major issues with the use of animal manure as a fertilizer. There's big issues with greenhouse gas emissions with organic. It's by no means a panacea, but what we need to move towards is to the greatest extent possible a high yield, low impact farming. And farmers like Tolly, researchers like the Land Institute in Kansas, which are developing perennial grain crops, they point to some of the ways in which we could start to do that, in which we could massively reduce our use of fertilizers, of pesticides, of ploughing, of other destructive techniques while maintaining high food yields. Mm-hmm. That's the holy grail, because it's all very well saying, well, we're going to have these less destructive techniques, but you're only going to produce half the yield that you were producing before. That plainly isn't going to work, because it's going to be more destructive in terms of land use.
You write about soil a bit, and how important it is to try and understand more about soil, about how tiny animals and microbes compete and collaborate. Tell me a bit about that, and how will understanding soil better make us better able to feed the planet in less harmful ways? So
it turns out that soil is a biological structure. It wouldn't be there if it weren't for the creatures which have built it for their own purposes. And so, starting with bacteria, they build these tiny little capsules. They use the carbon in the soil as cement to stick together the mineral particles, and those they have remarkable properties. Even if you air dry soil, the humidity within those capsules remains at 98%, and still remains a perfect home for those bacteria. And then the small soil animals build their capsules out of the bacterial ones, and then the giants of the soil, like ants and worms, build theirs out of the ones created by the small animals. And it's fractally scaled, so it's got the same structure at all levels of magnification, which makes it very resilient in the state of nature. Unless it's degraded, soil is a remarkably robust structure, which is why it doesn't all get swept off the land. And as I say, it would not exist if it weren't for the creatures that have made it. But one of the things we've also learned is that within this biological structure, fertility is as much a property of soil biology as it is of soil chemistry, because the bacteria and the fungi, particularly in the soil, they mediate the relationship between plants and minerals. Mm-hmm. A plant can't gather minerals without the bacteria and fungi with which it has symbiotic relationships, and it feeds them with sugars, sometimes up to 40% of the sugar that a plant makes through photosynthesis. It dumps in the soil to feed the bacteria, which in turn feed it with minerals and supply it with growth hormones and stimulate its immune response. And building on that knowledge, and this is what this extraordinary farmer Ian Tolhurst, Tolly, has been doing, we can now find ways of tweaking that relationship so that bacteria and fungi will deliver to the plant exactly the minerals it needs when it needs them, and lock the minerals up when the plant doesn't need them. And locking it up is just as important as making them available, because unless you lock the minerals up, they will leach away and flow off into the nearest river.
And go to waste, right.
And go to waste.
You also write about a new sort of cuisine. You investigate bacteria pancakes. That doesn't make my mouth water. Tell us about bacteria pancakes.
So this
I feel I've only made them by mistake in the past.
Actually, you probably make them all the time, because everything we eat is stuffed with bacteria. But this is deliberately making things out of bacteria. It's called precision fermentation. It's a refined form of brewing. And it's now being pursued by several companies, including one in Helsinki that I visited, where they are multiplying up bacteria in vats, which produce a flour that's 60% protein, 30% fat. You can use it to make just about anything that or any of the foods that we now get protein and fat from, and to substitute with a massively smaller environmental impact the meat and the other animal products that we eat. And so, yes, I was the first person outside the laboratory to eat a pancake made from this bacterial flour, and it tasted just like a pancake.
Like a normal pancake?
It really tasted like a normal pancake.
Like a good normal pancake, or like a slightly bland normal pancake?
It was succulent. I mean, pancakes don't have a huge amount of flavour, but it had pretty well exactly the same flavour. In this case, we had to dilute the bacterial flour with wheat flour, because normally when you're making a pancake, right, you raise the protein content of the wheat flour by adding eggs and milk. But in this case, we had to reduce it, otherwise we would have made an omelette. But obviously the aim is not to make pancakes, or not just pancakes. You can make almost anything now from those products, including a whole range of foods we can't even think of at the moment because they've yet to be invented.
What's your usual dietary situation, if I can ask? I should know. Are you a vegetarian or a vegan or anything
I'm
like that?
I'm a vegan, but I'm a very innovative vegan, and I'm very keen to experiment with every new food stuff that comes along. For people
who and this may be a terrible presumptions I'm making about vegan food, but for people who aren't vegans, who are used to their sausages and their steak, people enjoy this kind of food. Indeed, they treasure this kind of food. How do you deal with those people? How do you make them allies rather than roadblocks?
Sure. I mean, I totally understand that. I mean, before I became vegan, I loved my meat and my cheese, and to an extent I miss it. And at the moment, the substitutes for it aren't so good. I mean, the plant-based meats are a bit rubbish, really. But I think we're on the cusp of having much, much better substitutes. I mean, things which are effectively identical, very, very hard to distinguish from the real thing that comes from an animal. And yet with a tiny fraction of the environmental impact, and of course without the cruelty involved in producing foods from animals. So hopefully we won't have to struggle too hard to win people over, because it will be pretty well the same.
How do you begin to do that? Is this something that you win public support for or political support for? Because I mean, both of those seem like a big ask.
Well,
a big challenge.
Yeah, I think first of all you have to get the price right. And we have to make sure that these substitutes are as cheap or cheaper than the meat they're replacing, because most people won't pay a premium for a replacement. But what has happened in the past, if you think of the printing press or the contraceptive pill, is that when a technology aligns with an ethical shift, it can suddenly accelerate that shift and precipitate social change much faster than was happening before. And I hope we're on the cusp of a techno-ethical shift.
But you're talking about you've got to price in the transformation of the economy, everything from agriculture to your chicken shop on the corner. I mean, this is a huge upheaval in how our economy works if we're no longer going to be eating that kind of food, right?
Well, I mean, we don't really have a lot of choice in that. Unless we transform our economy, we're heading towards a cliff edge at great speed. Our life support systems only have a certain amount of tolerance in them, and they have tipping points. They're complex systems. They have thresholds. If you cross those thresholds, they can suddenly flip from one equilibrium state to a completely different one. And unless we do transform our economies very quickly, to get out of fossil fuels, but also to get out of a whole lot of other damaging industries and into more benign ones, and in doing so to stimulate a great new food and industrial and indeed agricultural revolution, then it's hard to see us getting through this century.
When
Go on.
Yeah, no. Well, when the fight back comes against your ideas from big pharma, if you like, rather than big pharma, they call you wacky, they call you eccentric. They say these ideas are crazy. Do you revel slightly in being a revolutionary in that sense? I mean, do you shy away from taking a more conciliatory and practical approach because you think it's important to make a big hit and a big splash, or do you genuinely believe that this can be done?
Well, I think it can be done. So 9 years ago, I wrote a book called Feral about rewilding, right? And I was widely denounced as mad, bad and dangerous to know, and it was considered completely insane and ridiculous. Most people had never heard of rewilding. Those who had were horrified by the idea. Well, last week, Rewilding Britain's Garden won the Chelsea Flower Show, which is, you can't get more mainstream and establishment than that. And this idea has just raged through the country. It is now generally accepted, or so it seems, not obviously by everyone, but no idea is accepted by everyone, but it has flipped. And I think, just like these other complex systems, society has its tipping points and can suddenly shift from sort of one state of acceptance to a different state of acceptance. And in fact, there's been some really interesting research on this, both experimental and observational, suggesting it's about 25% penetration. When sort of 25% of people are broadly in favour of a new idea, then the rest of society seems to swing round behind it. We're always looking out for where the status quo is. Our antennae are constantly twitching, and if we perceive that the wind has changed, we'll turn to catch it. And it's if it's happened with rewilding, which frankly was a lot more unpopular than some of the stuff that I'm proposing at the moment, I don't see why it can't happen for these ideas too.
Okay, well, look, I think as Professor Sir David King, the former Chief Scientific Advisor to the UK government, put it, it is, in my view, one of the 2 or 3 most important books to appear this century, which is a hell of a cover quote, so maybe you're onto something. George Monbiot, thanks very much indeed.